A very warm welcome to all of you, to all our participants and all our speakers to today's webinar on the outcomes from CBD COP15 that took place last year in Montreal. The webinar is co-organized by the Hassan II International Center for Environmental Education and the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, and here in particular under the lead of its specialist group for biodiversity law, which is chaired by Professor Emmanuel Kazembasi and co-chaired by Professor Michelle Lim, and the early career group of the World Commission on Environmental Law. This webinar is also part of the IUCN webinar series on the transformative power of law in addressing global environmental challenges. And that's a webinar series where we seek to address recent contemporary environmental legal developments and the role of law, of environmental law therein. My name is Christina Boyd, and I am the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and a professor of law at the University of Oslo in Norway. A very special thanks goes to Maître Ayman Shekhawi. He's the WCEL Deputy Chair, and as well to the Hassan II International Center for the organization of this particular webinar. And another thanks goes to Mr. Roberto Coll, the Executive Officer of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, who stood for all the logistics of this webinar. The webinar will be recorded and made available online in due course, and please check our social media posts on LinkedIn and Facebook for having access to the recording. Let me turn to saying a couple of words about the topic of today's webinar. Last year, on the 19th of December 2022, 196 parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The COP was held in Canada, but was presided by China. The framework is a response, a global multilateral response to the loss of biodiversity and environmental degradation worldwide, as assessed by the IPBES, as well as the Global Biodiversity Outlook. It succeeds the 2011 to 2020 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, including the Aichi targets, which were, as we know, not achieved to a significant extent. So the new Global Biodiversity Framework commits parties to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 through a theory of change and towards a world of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The biodiversity framework consists of 4 global goals for 2050 and 23 action targets for the current decade until 2030. Amongst those action targets, perhaps target 3, which foresees that by 2030, at least 30% of land and water areas are effectively conserved and managed, is the one that is most talked about and recognized. But there are another 23 targets in addition to that one. Now, the framework itself is not legally binding. It was adopted at the COP in decision 15/4, and it is completed by a set of further decisions by the Conference of the Parties. But it is important to remember that parties have legally committed to a number of obligations under the conventions, and parties have committed to updating their national biodiversity and action plans, NBSAPs, in light of the new targets, as well as to reporting on them using a number of headline indicators. And those obligations to communicate and National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, NBSAP, and national reports. These are legally binding obligations under the Convention in Article 6 and 26, respectively. Some further elements I'm sure we will discuss throughout the webinar today, which may be of particular importance to lawyers in that new global biodiversity framework, are the contribution and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, which is recognized as a cross-cutting element throughout the entire framework, as well as human rights-based approaches, including the recognition of a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. But also the relationships and consistency with other international agreement are or is an issue which should be of interest and concern to lawyers, as well as issues of intergenerational and global equity. Further element which also requires additional work are nature-based solutions that are for the first time explicitly recognized in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and where the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has of course already done significant work, in particular in its global standard for nature-based solutions. Eventually, it will be the law that will be decisive in effectively implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework. And it will be the law both on the international, but also on the national level. Internationally in terms of further defining the framework, but also in defining the relationship and synergies with other international agreements, for example, the Paris Agreement on climate change. But also, and perhaps most importantly, it will be national legislation, compliance, and enforcement that will be decisive for the effectiveness of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And this is why we are here today. This is why we gathered our eminent speakers to this webinar, where we invite our speakers, everyone involved, to share their views, their reflections, their knowledge, and their expectations about the new Global Biodiversity Framework and its complementing decisions. Law will be central in our discussions, as well as legal education. And that's hopefully a good segue to introduce our opening speaker, that is Ms. Naswa Alaoui. She is the Secretary General of the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection in Morocco. She has a wealth of information experience in the field of environment and sustainable development. For the last 2 decades, under the leadership of Her Royal Highness Princess Lala Hasna, Ms. Alaoui has led the foundation to be evolving from an impactful, aspirational organization to an established and worldwide recognized institution. She is an active and committed ESD promoter as member of the Economic, Social and Environmental Council of the Kingdom of Morocco, and a member of the scientific committees of COP22, which took place in 2016 in Marrakesh in Morocco, the World Environmental Education Congress, the Education and Communication Commission of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as well as the Mission 4.7 Education Task Force of Experts. Mrs. Alaoui is also the Secretary General of the Foundation for the Safeguarding of Cultural Heritage of Rabat. She has an academic background in sustainable development, organizational management, and leadership in civil society organizations. And it's a great pleasure, Ms. Alaoui, to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words. And it seems a lot of commitment that I have to do, but I am very proud to be helped by a great team. And one of them is with us today, who is Mr. Sharqawi. So we are really talking about a whole team behind all these titles that I do have. First of all, dear Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, dear Chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, dear Director of the IUCN International Policy Center, distinguished speaker and partners, dear participants. First of all, I would like to highlight first the commitment of His Majesty King Mohammed VI regarding all the environmental and sustainable development issues. This has been a constant throughout his reign for most than 20 years today. And more recently, he indicated in his speech to the 2022 Summit of Heads of State and Government on Drought and Sustainable Land Management that our fights implies action on several fronts, particularly the preservation of ecosystem, the conservation of biodiversity, and reduction of the precariousness of vulnerable population, which is one of our main issues that we all share today. Environmental youth leadership is therefore of paramount importance to us as the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection, under the leadership of her president, Her Royal Highness Princess Al Hassan. And I am particularly glad that one of the segments of today's webinar is dedicated to youth leadership and in biodiversity. This is also why we at the Mohammed VI Foundation are happy to partner with the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity for this event, unpacking the key outcomes of COP15. The Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection took part in person to COP15 and engaged actively with a particular focus on education for sustainable development and youth. When it comes to the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, I would like to stress that education and youth, two core priorities of the Foundation's work, are critical components of implementation. Youth is identified in the framework as a key stakeholder that must contribute in a full and effective manner, and whose meaningful participation in decision-making must be ensured in decision-making process at all levels, and guided by the principle, of course, of intergenerational equity. This is a key pillar of our work at the Foundation, and it is reflected in all our programs. For example, we work on daily basis with youth in Morocco through our eco-schools and young reporters for the environment programs. And you will hear later on one of our young reporter, Aya, who will share with you her statement. We also work with youth all across Africa through the African Green Universities and Youth Education Network in partnership with the United Nations Environmental Programme and the Youth Education Alliance, as well as the African Youth Climate Hub in partnership with, among other partners, YONGO, the official children and youth constituency of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Concretely, this work means convening events such as today's, designing and disseminating pedagogical tools, and incubating youth-led projects, always in co-construction with youth. As for education, it is clearly featured in the framework. Let us refer, for example, to the fact that the implementation of the framework requires transformative, innovative, and transdisciplinary education, formal and informal at all levels, including science policy, interface studies, and lifelong learning process. Specifically on this topic, we co-organized during the United Nations Secretary-General Transforming Education Summit on September 2022, an official side event with UNESCO and the Ministry of National Education and Ivory Coast. And during that side event, we shared key aspects of the work we have been undertaking for 20 years on this transformational agenda. Educational frameworks, roadmaps, as well as best practices in Morocco and more broadly in Africa. In addition, both targets 16 and 21 of the framework highlight education. For example, target 21 indicate that we must strengthen communication, awareness raising education, monitoring, research, and knowledge management. The pursuit of those targets has been at the core of the work of the Foundation for more than 2 decades. As a matter of fact, we have been facilitating impactful, on-the-ground action through our work on beaches, coastlines, seas and oceans, air quality, climate change, biodiversity, and ecosystem restoration with the public at large, the youth, academia, the public and private sectors. Our work to safeguard and develop the Marrakesh palm grove through an ecosystem approach that includes cultural dimensions is a focal point of our commitment to biodiversity. In conclusion, I would like to leave you with 2 key messages. First of all, to reassure that Her Royal Highness Princess Al Hasna is committed through her foundation and its academic arm, the Hassan II International Center for Environmental Protection, and stand really ready to collaborate further to implement the outcomes of this CBD COP15 in Morocco, regionally in Africa and the Mediterranean, as well as globally in synergy with our work with United Nations system and other partners. We know how to do that. For instance, in the context of the Global School Program in partnership with UNESCO and SDSN, as a member of the Education Task Force of Mission 4.7, I work in the context of the 4th Sustainable Development Goal to ensure that by 2030, all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. Second of all, I would like to share with you my belief that today we are already implementing the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as indicated in the section K of the framework, enhancing communication, education and awareness on biodiversity, and the uptake of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework by all actors is essential to achieve its effective implementation and behavioral change, promote sustainable lifestyles and biodiversity values. Dear all, our message is one of hope and action. Our strength is one of inclusion and partnership. Our commitment is one of sustainability and impact. I invite you all to leverage today's opportunity to learn from one another, inspire each other for people and the planet. Thank you very much, and I wish you all great event.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary General. Thank you for being here with us today, but thank you also for the collaboration between your foundation and the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, not only on this webinar, but also beyond. And thanks for highlighting youth and education in our joint work. Thank you so much. Right. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Mrs. Sonia Peña Moreno for her opening remarks. Sonia Peña Moreno is the director of the International Policy Center at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, at the IUCN. For the last 18 years, she's been working at the headquarters of the IUCN in Gland in Switzerland. And until early 2021, Sonja was the coordinator for global biodiversity policy and governance within the Global Policy Unit, where she led IUCN's biodiversity policy work, mainly in the context of the CBD, but also with respect to other biodiversity-related conventions and agreements, as well as other UN processes. Sonja also was the head of delegation, as far as I understand, in Montreal, and spoke on behalf, intervened on behalf of the IUCN during COP15. Sonja holds professional degrees on political science and modern languages from the University of Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. Sonja, we are very glad that you're with us here today, and the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Christina, and many thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure to join you all. Let me start by reading something out for you. Biodiversity is fundamental to human well-being, a healthy planet, and economic prosperity for all people, including for living well in balance and in harmony with Mother Earth. We depend on it for food, medicine, energy, clean air and water, security from natural disasters, as well as recreation and cultural inspiration. And it supports all systems of life on Earth. This is the first paragraph of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, adopted in December last year in Montreal. I believe it sets very well the scene for today's session and discussion. So let's reflect on the process that culminated with the adoption of this new framework to galvanize action in order to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, achieve recovery and restoration, and in so doing, get us to a world of living in harmony with nature by 2050. I want to organize my brief remarks under three headings: urgency, response, and action. Let's start with urgency. Although nature underpins the world economy, supporting nearly 50% of the global GDP, it is declining at the fastest rate in human history. Over the last decades, the planet has been experiencing record temperatures. Natural catastrophes are becoming more frequent and more intense, with overwhelming effects on human lives and high economic costs. You can only look at the news today of what is happening in Turkey and Syria, for instance. And then there is still COVID-19 around the corner, which has brought nations to a halt, caused millions of deaths around the world, wrecked economies and jobs, and ultimately evidenced our broken relationship with nature. So with this background in mind, it is not surprising that there were very high expectations about COP15 and the outcomes of that meeting, and numerous calls on the way to Montreal and during the meeting in Montreal for the adoption of an ambitious global biodiversity framework. This was deemed as a make or break COP. So let me turn now to the response. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it's a roadmap which aims to ease, enable, and fund action essential to address biodiversity loss and put us all on a path to achieve that 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. The agreement represents a balanced outcome after very complicated and very contentious negotiations over the course, I would say, of 4 long years between the last COP14 and the COP15, intense ministerial consultations while we were in Montreal, and the intervention of the Chinese COP presidency to propose at the very last part of the COP a package deal that all delegations could actually live with. We now have a framework, as Christina was just mentioning, with 4 goals for 2050, 23 carefully negotiated action targets for 2030, and the indicators to measure progress against those goals and targets. So what's next? And that I turn to action then. The perfectly drafted text won't do the trick. And the devil will be actually on the details, and more specifically on how effective the targets are to enable concrete and incremental action at national and global levels to tackle the loss of biodiversity, or the biodiversity crisis we're facing. 2023 must be the year when we actually turn the page, leave the entrenched national positions that characterize the negotiations aside, and swiftly move into implementation. And I think we're well equipped to do so. There is a wealth of scientific and technical biodiversity data and information. Granted, it needs to be channeled appropriately and get to the countries to make good use of it. And there are numerous tools and mechanisms available, as well as capacity development initiatives and opportunities. However, I think there are at least two conditions that must be met if the move into implementation of that new framework is to start off with the right foot. First, sustained financial resources must be secured and invested in conservation action, particularly in developing countries, and pledges must be maintained. This is why the COP decision on resource mobilization, that is one of the 6 decisions of the package deal, let's say, is so relevant. In effect, the COP15 recognizes the urgency to increase international biodiversity finance, considering the need for adequacy, predictability, and the timely flow of funds. And in doing so, decides to establish a dedicated and accessible GBF fund from this year to quickly mobilize and disburse new and additional resources from all sources proportionate to the ambition of the GBF. And then Target 19 on resource mobilization complements this decision. The second condition is that a global biodiversity framework will only succeed if all actors and sectors contribute to its implementation. So alongside governments, the contributions of non-state actors, civil society, women, youth, as was mentioned before, indigenous peoples, businesses, and others are indispensable, as are those of all sectors and domains of society. So from health, trade, food, energy, law, peace and security, to name a few. This is, after all, a collective responsibility of all of us. So let me end by highlighting IUCN's engagement at the COP15 and throughout the whole global biodiversity framework process, which actually was substantial. Only at COP15, we had 90 delegates, 70 or so present on site in Montreal, and then the rest connected online as part of our delegation. And coming from all parts of the IUCN world, so commission members, secretariat members, and some even counselors and commission chairs. Since the process started, we produced at least 10 position papers with recommendations to the parties on the key elements that we considered were part of that agreement, and where IUCN had much more to contribute and more value to add, let's say. We prepared information and policy briefs, made at least 25 submissions to the CBD when there were calls for contributions on the different elements of the framework, engaged in all of the open-ended working group meetings, we sent delegations to all of them, hosted numerous side events throughout, run a series of webinars like this one, briefings, pre-COPs and meetings, etc. And ahead of, for instance, the last COP, precisely to prepare, ourselves, and especially addressing our members ahead of those meetings. And there were many other things. We hosted, the Nature Positive Pavilion in Montreal, together with a number of organizations that are members of IUCN. They did a lot of reach out to the media in terms of, for instance, the Red List release that was at the time of the COP released, et cetera, et cetera. So we are now ready for the next phase. We are ready to, one, contribute to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework through the actual implementation of the program of IUCN, the program of work of IUCN, and the resolutions and recommendations that are adopted by our members, and specifically the ones that were adopted in the last Congress in 2021 in Marseille. 22 of those resolutions link directly to the Global Biodiversity Framework. Of course, they were preceding the adoption of the framework, but they were calling for a strong, a very bold and actionable also Global Biodiversity Framework, and gave the mandate to the Union to engage very strongly in this process. So we're committed to follow up on those resolutions. Then we're ready also to mobilize the Secretariat, the commissions, all 7 of them, and our members, among others, to socialize the Global Biodiversity Framework. What is it that we adopted in Montreal? I think it's important to unpack all of the elements and what does that mean? Like those 23 targets, what do they say? How do we translate them into actual action on the ground? Provide the data that is needed through IUCN's knowledge products and tools, and build capacity. We are also ready to capitalize on the immediate opportunities to roll out, for instance, the targets, again, that are closer to the work of IUCN, or where we consider we add more value. So target 1, for instance, on spatial planning, target 2 on restoration, target 3 on the famous 30 by 30 protected areas, OACMs, target 4 on species, 8 and 11 that are addressing nature-based solutions, in climate and in relation to nature's contributions to people, and many others. We are also ready to continue to enhance our contributions for nature platform, where this is a platform where IUCN members can document their conservation and restoration actions. And in doing so, they link up to the global goals and targets. We're also committed to fill the gaps in improving the current monitoring framework, so contributing with more data towards building up or beefing up that indicators framework, and much more. So I'll just say to end, let's roll our sleeves and get going. And thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for being with us today. As you described very aptly, the IUCN is an important stakeholder in this global process, in particular because it bridges the science policy legal silos that we in other places often see. So it has this integrated approach between science policy and governance. And I would also like to use this opportunity to thank you very much for your very skillful and excellent leading of the IUCN delegation in Montreal. Thanks, Sonia. And with that, it's my great pleasure to reintroduce my dear colleague, the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law's Deputy Chair, Mr. Ayman Cherkaoui, for the moderation of the remainder of this webinar. Mr. Ayman Cherkaoui is the Deputy Chair, as I said, for the Commission, as well as the Director of the Hassan II International Center for Environmental Training, and in Morocco, which is like the academic arm, and I'm sure, Ayman, you're going to explain it in more detail, is the academic part of the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection. Ayman is also lead counsel for climate change at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and he is regional facilitator of major groups and stakeholders for Africa, elected by African organizations and accredited to UNEP. Previously, he was special advisor for the presidency of COP22, as well as legal advisor to the Environment Minister of Morocco. Ayman, with that, I'm very, very pleased to give the floor to you for the further moderation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina, for giving me the floor. And it's such a delight to be moderating the rest of this session. We have heard so far about the transformative power of law, about youth and education, about urgency, response, and action. Before moving to the presentation of the overall program and introducing our keynote speaker, I couldn't help but notice that as we were listening to Sonia, and she was referring to the all approach, all society approach, and the contribution of women in the context of today's webinar, with the exception of the moderator. All the speakers happen to be women. So beyond contribution, I think it's really leadership that we are seeing in action. And as the Secretary General of the Foundation was saying, we're already in implementation mode. So I think it's something to be celebrated very much indeed. Regarding the today's program, so first of all, we'll be listening to and learning when it comes to the keynote in terms of the outcomes from COP15. I'll be saying a bit more about the keynote shortly. Secondly, we'll have 3 sessions. The first session looking at the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework through a legal lens. We're happy to be listening to Professor Michelle Lim, who I'll be reintroducing later on. The second session will be Youth Leadership in Biodiversity, and we'll be enjoying remarks from 3 speakers in that particular session, Ms. Weto Asrotra Bashayam, Ms. Julieta Sarno, and Ms. Aya Lacheb. And finally, we'll be learning about what approaches should universities take to ensure that species and ecosystem begin to recover from a global perspective. So now, let us, as Sonia invited us to do, roll our sleeves and get going with our program today. And the first and very important part of that will be, of course, our keynote speech by Ms. Elizabeth Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary of the Secretariat on the Convention on Biological Diversity. However, on December 27, 2022, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced her appointment as Deputy Executive Director of UNEP. So that will be something that we are very much looking forward to. She's also a member of the IUCN Work Commission Environmental Law Steering Committee, has been so for some time now, and we've been at the Commission very grateful for her leadership and commitment. Prior to that, Ms. Mrema served as Director of the Law Division at United Nations Environment Programme in Nairobi, Kenya. She has over 2 decades of experience at the United Nations. She brings to her various positions extensive experience in global environmental law and policy making, implementation of environmental and sustainable development programs, and a deep knowledge of multilateral processes. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the Executive Secretary of the UNEP Secretariat of the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, as well as served as the Acting Executive Secretary of the UNEP Agreement on the Conservation of Small Cetaceans of the Baltic, Northeast Atlantic, Irish, and North Seas, as well as Interim Executive Secretary of the UNEP Gorilla Agreement. As you can see, I'm grateful that I have a decent breathing capacity because her various experiences are most impressive indeed and inspiring. Before joining UNEP, Ms. Mrema worked with the United Republic of Tanzania's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. She holds a Master of Law degree from Dalhousie University in Canada, a postgraduate diploma in International Relations and Diplomacy from the Center of Foreign Relations and Diplomacy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, as well as a Bachelor's of Law from the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So just to make sure that you're in the full capacity as dear participant to fully enjoy her remarks, I wanted to briefly indicate to you some logistical elements. First, that this webinar is live translated, as I'm sure you've already noticed, in different languages. If you want to make sure that you are listening to the interventions in French, Spanish, or Arabic, you can click on the bottom of the screen in Zoom and choose the language of your liking. Similarly, of course, for English. Some of you have already prevailed themselves from the Q&A options of the Zoom online tool. If you have yet to identify where it is again near the bottom of the screen of the Zoom window. You are welcome to click it and indicate your questions that you would like to see fielded in the context of the webinars. There will be 2 opportunities later on for speakers to react to questions that they choose to. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayan, for that long introduction. I'm not sure if I deserve it, but you are asking me to speak on the outcomes of the COP15 of the CBD. All has already been said by the previous speakers. I'm not sure anything much is still remain to be said by me, but I will try with some repetition here and there as relevant. First, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. And I sincerely thank your own entity, my previous speakers. IUCN generally has not been just an important stakeholder, but an important partner in the work of the conservation on biodiversity. So my sincere thanks and thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to be able to share a few words on what outcomes were achieved in Montreal in December. Just for the knowledge of participants, much as we all talk of Convention on Biological Diversity, we need to remember that this convention is complemented by two protocols. There's a protocol on biosafety and a protocol on access and benefit sharing. And the December meeting, Conference of the Parties, basically was triple conference of the parties as well as meeting of the parties. So we had the CBD or Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties. At the same time, we also had the meeting, 10th meeting of the parties to the Biosafety or Cartagena Protocol, and the 4th meeting of the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. In addition, we also had during the COP days, dates which were from 7th to 22nd, we also had a ministerial high-level segment, a segment of 3 days basically attended by ministers globally. As Sonia had already remarked or indicated, the adoption, which was a principal or primary outcome of the Conference of the Parties, the world globally was waiting, had been a long process. A long process which actually, I should say, was an opportunity. Opportunity, and I will explain probably why. Ideally, this framework would have been negotiated in a span of 2 years because the conferences of the parties or the COPs is every 2 years. And if not for the pandemic situation, unfortunate situation of the pandemic, which resulted us all being in a lockdown, we would have had our COP at 2020. But that would have meant the text which finally got adopted in December probably would have been in a completely different shape than if it had been adopted 2 years ago. 1, 2, not just to have been in a different shape, the opportunity of that extended period we had gave the opportunity us, and particularly the co-chairs responsible for the development of the framework, that opportunity to engage and consult literally all stakeholders. And that's why Sonia had mentioned, whether you are talking of IPLCs, Indigenous Peoples Local Community, the business, the youth, the women, the financial sector, the cities, you name it, all were consulted and engaged. Probably this will not have happened if not for that opportunity of the extended period. 3, that extended period also enabled us to actually be able to take the lessons learned from the failures of the reaching achievements of the Aichi biodiversity targets, building them into the negotiation process. And key among them was actually the engagement of stakeholders. When the Aichi biodiversity targets were negotiated over 12 years ago and adopted, there was that expectation that the implementation responsibility was on the parties, on the governments. While we know very well biodiversity is a cross-cutting issue, it cannot be dealt by governments alone. And because the other stakeholders were not effectively engaged, they did not own the biodiversity targets. Equally, they did not own the implementation process, notwithstanding, not surprising that we are not able to achieve the targets as expected. Furthermore, another major lessons learned as the result, when the Aichi biodiversity targets were adopted, many countries literally took a step back and began the process of the development review updating of the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, a process which took for many countries 3-4 years. So in actual fact, the Aichi targets, much as they were expected to be implemented for a full decade of 10 years, it was actually 5-6 years for many countries. So not surprising, we are not able to reach and achieve those targets because the implementation period was less. We hope this time that had been taken care of by one. Literally over 185 countries currently already have their NBSAPs in place, which are generally good enough to continue implementation and not to start afresh or to reinventing the wheel. And two, we also hope that as countries are looking at updating their NBSAPs, that does not mean stopping action, as Sonia underlined. Actions continued while updating can happen, particularly as now we expect countries to also determine their national targets. And this is again the other lesson learned from the failure of the Aichi biodiversity targets, that we know that at national level, many countries actually had achieved and even exceeded the global targets. But because the national targets were not aligned with the global targets and our assessment was at global level, then we ended up with that conclusion that none of the Aichi biodiversity targets were achieved by 2020 globally. But at national level, that was not the case. A number of countries had advanced, but because of that misalignment. So we hope these are some of those lessons learned that can be avoided this time to enable us really to reach those targets by 2030. So that was a good opportunity for the negotiations, but of course, a terrible situation globally, because yes, we lost millions economically were lost and the like. So let me move straight. What did we achieve as the result of the conference of the parties, meetings of the parties in December? Primarily, the globe was waiting, and as Sonia indicated, that was the COP to make it or break it. And everybody was waiting for that. Delighted that we made it. And what is now called Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. Was adopted as a package. Why a package? Because it also includes, one will say, instruments for its implementation. And the package included the monitoring framework for the Global Biodiversity Framework. It included a mechanism for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. It included resource mobilization strategy. It also included capacity building and development, technical and scientific cooperation, and digital sequencing information for genetic resources. So that was the package which composed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. But of course, I will come to it later that there were also other several decisions which were adopted, because in total, we had about 69 decisions which were adopted, but we know the world out there was more focused on the framework. As had already been indicated, so now we have the new Global Biodiversity Framework, a framework with 4 long-term goals. The goals, global goals, which will enable us to reach the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. What does that mean? Living in harmony with nature will be, hopefully by 2050, biodiversity will be well maintained, well conserved, well restored, sustainably used, and the resources equitably and fairly shared among the resources shared equitably across the globe. It also, as we have read, the framework contains 23 actionable targets to be achieved by 2030. 2030 is an important year, as we all know, and clearly it indicates that the frameworks are squarely aligned with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, knowing very well also that over 14 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals will actually be achieved as the big result of the contribution of biodiversity conservation, restoration, and sustainable use. So biodiversity plays a major role to the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals, without which we might fail also to achieve those SDGs. So the 23 targets clearly align with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And we can cluster the 23 targets into probably 3 clusters. One, which is target 1 to 8, basically dealing with reducing threats to biodiversity. And target 9 to 13, which deals with meeting people's needs through the sustainable use and benefit sharing of the genetic resources. And target 14 to the last 23 deals with tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming of biodiversity issues. The framework also provides, or it begins with the background, the purpose of the framework, consideration for implementation. As I said, it links with 2030 Agenda. It is a theory of change, and now the 2050 long-term vision with the 2030 mission, which is accompanied now by those targets. It also includes the implementation and support mechanism and enabling conditions. It also includes accountability and responsibility and transparency. And as we have heard, communication, education, awareness, and uptake of those actions. So clearly, as I've indicated, this time, unlike the Aichi biodiversity targets had been thought, that this new global framework is a framework for all, universal application. So all governments, all countries, all stakeholders, all multilateral agreements, all organizations, the entire UN system. And therefore it clearly provides mechanism which we hope will foster synergies and complementarity in the implementation, particularly of the related other environmental international treaties. It provides that mechanism of whole of government, whole of society approach, as well as integration through mainstreaming of biodiversity into all sectors. As I said, so that is all makes that package of the new Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. In addition, there were a number of other decisions which were also taken and adopted, which actually will support the implementation of this framework. And the other decisions include decisions related to cooperation with other conventions, cooperation with other international organizations, communication strategy, gender plan of action for the implementation of the framework, plan of action for subnational governments, cities, and local governments for the implementation of the framework, and also guidance to the global GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, because that will be key in the provision of funding resources for the implementation of the framework. In addition, we have other decisions taken on other issues, but all of which will complement implementation of the global framework. Decisions on synthetic biology, on nature and culture, on biodiversity and agriculture, biodiversity and health, climate change and biodiversity, and many others. I had mentioned earlier the meetings of the two protocols, biosafety and access and benefit sharing. There were also specific decisions adopted under the umbrella of these protocols, again, to support implementation of this global biodiversity framework. So for the biosafety protocol in particular, they adopted the implementation plan for the biosafety 2021-2030. So again, that's the period of the targets of the framework. They also adopted capacity building action plan for the biosafety protocol, while the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing also adopted measures to assist in capacity building, and more important, the process for further negotiations on the digital sequencing information on genetic resources. It has already been underlined the importance of the participation and engagement of stakeholders, which was tremendous this time. It had never happened probably in the history of the convention. And in Montreal in particular, that participation and how all that then has led to all stakeholders seeing themselves in the targets which have been adopted had been phenomenal. So in Montreal, for instance, we had a summit for subnational governments and cities. We had Nature and Culture Summit, Science Policy Forum for Biodiversity, Business and Biodiversity Forum. We had Finance and Biodiversity Day. We had 3 days of Youth Summit. And this leaving alone over 200 side events, specific thematic pavilions and exhibitions. And that's why today we can claim that this framework is indeed for all, because all stakeholders can see themselves in the framework. So just to finish in terms of, one will say, a quick analysis of that framework. As I said, it took 4 years of consultations and engagement. And I think we can rightly conclude it is a solid document that takes into account the views of all actors, all stakeholders, and everybody can see themselves there, including us as individuals. It has clearly taken into account the lessons learned from the inadequacies or failures of their biodiversity targets, and I've enumerated some of them. And probably one which I had not mentioned is the financing gap, which Sonia also alluded. If there is one issue which was really controversial during the negotiations to the last minute, was the finance aspect. Developing countries literally had said there will be no framework without funds on the table. There will be no framework, and it's not just the funds. Actually, the pressure at the beginning was, if biodiversity is as important as climate change, and if 30% of climate mitigation will come from biodiversity, the nature-based solutions, then climate change actions will never succeed without biodiversity action. And therefore, if there is $100 billion pledged, committed for climate change, why not for biodiversity? If there are several climate change funding baskets, why not one that major funding basket for biodiversity? So developing countries really wanted to see a new biodiversity dedicated fund being established. Okay, finally that did not go through, and the compromise was a dedicated fund established under the Global Environmental Facility. Personally, I think that was a good decision, because Jeff, you have a mechanism, a structure which is already in place, because it would have taken again 4 or 5 years before a new funding governance structure could have been put in place and have it operational. So in addition, because of some criticisms on the fund availability and accessibility of funding, there is also a decision asking GEF to review its accessibility of resources as it establishes this funding. So now, at least delighted, there will be that dedicated fund for biodiversity through GEF. The government of China, during the first part of COP, also established a $230 million biodiversity fund, inviting other donors also to contribute to it. The Japan government, which had established a Japan Biodiversity Fund managed by the Secretariat in 2010, have extended the operation of that fund with additional resources. So we hope with this as a means of implementation and resources and increasing financial resources at all levels is provided in one of the targets, both international, regional, and domestic resources will enable countries to be able then to overcome some of those challenges of the past. Sonia underlined, we are now in the period of action. And action means you'll have started already yesterday and not tomorrow to avoid any delay. We are already in 2023, and we hope those actions to update NBSUBs will be taken, will be a rapid realignment of the NBSUBs with the new global biodiversity framework. And delighted with the support, again, from the Global Environmental Facility, GEF 7, they have provided resources under GEF 7 Early Action Grant and GEF 8 replenishment, which was the highest for biodiversity in the history of the GEF. Again, now in addition with the Global Biodiversity Fund in GEF, all will also help to really get the countries up to speed and avoid any delay, because especially the support from GEF 7 is already operational as I speak. And of course, now we also expect other governing bodies of other international organizations and conventions, including IUCN, and the delighted IUCN Marcel had already done that, to endorse the GBF and align their strategies and contribute then to its implementation and monitoring. And of course, that full effective participation of all stakeholders will be key. And as we said, we have particularly, it is mentioned, Target 21 focusing on education, Target 22 focusing on full, equitable, inclusive, effective, gender responsive representation, participation in decision-making, access to justice and information related to biodiversity by indigenous peoples, local communities, respecting their cultures, their rights over land, territories, the rights of women and girls, children, youth, persons with disabilities, human rights defenders, all have been recognized under this Target 12, and Target 22, and the last target specifically on gender. So I hope this time we have no excuse. And if I may just end with the youth and the global biodiversity framework. Many efforts have included the youth issues in the framework. The youth, through a Youth Global Biodiversity Network, a program within the Secretariat, had ensured youth have been engaged throughout the negotiation process. They have been listened, their recommendations have been taken on board, and they can clearly be seen and read in a number of those targets. So youth have been engaged, and we hope then that will continue as we get into implementation. And we hope other initiatives involving schools, champions, ambassadors, even the pledges made by, I think, about 125 universities and nature positive universities. All these will be now time for implementation to take place. So probably I will stop there unless there are specific questions, but in a nutshell, that's what happened at COP15 and what was achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'd certainly love to listen to you for even longer, but thank you so much for that beautiful nutshell of a keynote that you shared with you. I would like to note for that keynote that you provided us with the key to unlocking, deepening our understanding, thanks to your broad, deep, and generous sharing of your expertise about these important issues. Thank you very much indeed. We heard about culture as well during the opening remarks, as you were just speaking now. And I was reminded of Pablo Picasso, who once said that action is the foundational key to all success. And I think really in the context of the keynote that we just heard, in the context of the opening remarks as well, we are clearly moving towards action that is very much needed, urgent. Thank you very much indeed. We'll now move to the first session of our webinar today, dedicated to looking through a legal lens at this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And to share with us this important perspective, we are very happy, delighted to have with us. I'm not quite sure what time is it for you right now, Michelle, but Professor Michelle Lim, who is the Deputy Chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law Biodiversity Law Specialist Group. She's also, of course, Associate Professor in Law at the Yung Pung Hau School of Law, Singapore Management University. She has completed a double degree in science, ecosystem management and law, and a PhD on legal and institutional arrangements for transboundary biodiversity conservation at University of New England. Michelle, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ayman, but also to Christina, Zainab, and Roberto for making this happen. And of course, thank you, Elizabeth, not only for that vivid walk through what happened at COP15, but also for all your contributions to making this multi-species world continue to be a bit more multi-species. Thank you. I am, however, and I'm bringing Nusa and Sonia into this, I am, however, facing a rather pressing, immediate, personal crisis, which is, what more could I add to this discussion? So perhaps there's no harm in reiterating what is at stake for human and non-human worlds and how we have come to this moment. At the same time, I think given all that that's at stake, it's critical that we're clear-eyed about what binding or otherwise obligations are created by the Global Biodiversity Framework. And finally, with consideration of the nature with which the GBF takes, and importantly, all the discussions about the range of people, organizations, and actors that need to be on board, I'll also talk through the discussion about the need to move beyond a public international law lens to more of a transnational law lens. So it's to these 3 points I'll now turn. And as Elizabeth has highlighted, the 2050 vision of the convention is a world in 27 years' time, a world which is living in harmony with nature. And Elizabeth so nicely took us through what it means, how it's been defined to live in harmony with nature. At the same time, goal A of the GBF, of course, aims towards halting human-induced extinction, and the extinction rate and risk of all species is reduced tenfold, and the abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. So much has happened at COP15, but at the same time, I think it's important to keep our eye on the ball in terms of the level of action that is needed in order. 27 years will go by in in a very short amount of time, and there's so much to do in that time. And at the same time, when you look at current trajectories of global biodiversity loss, you see worldwide trends of decline, both in the abundance of species and the extent of the natural world. And those that have shared this planet with humans since the beginning of time are going or gone forever at rates never before seen in human history. And this is despite the conclusion of the CBD in 1992, subsequent plans such as the 2010 target and the Aichi targets. Despite this, we continue to witness, in the words of Sandra Diaz, the unraveling of the fabric of life. Why? Human activity. Though important to stress that the responsibility lies much more squarely at the feet of some humans, but the 2019 IPBES Global Assessment identifies the direct drivers of biodiversity loss being land use change, sea use change, the direct exploitation of species, that's forestry, overfishing, also climate change already having a huge role in causing unprecedented biodiversity loss, pollution, invasive species. The IPBES Global Assessment also points to a range of underlying indirect drivers, social values, such as unsustainable consumption and production, issues of demography, trade, technological advances, and for our purposes, importantly, governance at multiple scales. And when talking about values, I think it's very helpful to draw on the 2022 IPBES Values Assessment. And the number one key message coming out of that is that the causes of the biodiversity crisis and opportunities to address them are tightly linked to the ways nature is valued in political and economic decisions at all levels. And they go on to highlight that an important driver of global decline of biodiversity is the unsustainable use of nature, including persistent inequalities between and within countries emanating from predominant political and economic decisions based on a narrow set of values. And that narrow set of values is prioritizing nature's values, such as those traded in markets. In other words, a prioritization of the instrumental values of biodiversity, how nature is useful to us. And yet, nature is valuable in its own right, its intrinsic values, but in the way we interact with nature, relational values. Key message 2 highlights that despite the diversity of nature's values, most policy-making approaches have prioritized that narrow set of values at the expense of both nature and society, future generations, and meanwhile ignored values associated to Indigenous peoples and local communities. In the meantime, the IPBES Global Assessment found that in areas managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities, you have significantly greater conservation and maintenance of the diversity of life. And yet that is being eroded through the erosion of land title and associated impacts. I'll return in a little bit to the monumental contribution of Indigenous peoples to the GBF, and we've heard quite a bit about the success in that sense already. But first, let's turn to the legal nature of the GBF itself. Because I keep hearing in the media this idea that the GBF is the Paris Agreement for biodiversity. I think it's important to be clear about what it is and what it isn't. So people familiar only with the Paris Agreement might have a conversation which goes something like this. Paris Agreement for biodiversity, that's really interesting. Tell me more. Is it because it has a binding and non-binding components? The response would be, well, it's a plan, it's a global plan, but it's generally agreed to be non-binding. Yes, it's a COP decision, so legal in that sense, but not in the sense that the Paris Agreement is binding. Okay, what about the monitoring and transparency framework? Yeah, thankfully, Elizabeth has walked us through that. So in that sense, we're seeing the architecture around it, which reflects some of what we're seeing in Paris. Okay, so is the Paris, the GBF, is it like Paris in terms of being a successor agreement to one of the protocols of the Convention on Biological Diversity? No, it's a successor agreement to Aichi. So you're starting to see the sense of, even though in the media, it's been in some ways portrayed as a Paris Agreement for biodiversity, I think it's important to be clear about legally what the GBF is and what it isn't. And that's why, importantly, all the issues that have been highlighted already by Sonia and Elizabeth in terms of the importance of engaging stakeholders, in many ways, even though they haven't used that language, it's moving towards this idea of a much more transnational approach to law, understanding that international law itself is inadequate, and therefore the need to engage if we want to address this issue, which in some ways is global, but on the other hand, so place-based, so related to particular communities, and so related to a range of other global actors, such as corporations, such as subnational governments. And you see that addressed, for example, in the Edinburgh Declaration linked to the GBF. And also, you see that in the targets themselves. For example, in the section C of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the discussion we've had so far about engaging a range of stakeholders, considerations for the implementation of the framework. The International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity worked so hard as part of the COP. And you see as the first consideration, the contribution of the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And importantly, drawing on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that is very well integrated into a range of targets. We've heard already about target 22, but importantly, across other targets, such as target 3, the 30 by 30, including the target 1, target 21. And importantly, target 15, which directly addresses corporations. The idea that states, countries are the only global actors, that is a very outdated one if it was ever real in the first place. But now more than ever, the increasing role of corporations as multinationals, as important global actors, it's very reassuring to see target 15 directly address not only how consumers, individuals can be informed about biodiversity loss, but language about disclosure included in target 15. And as well as that, associated with the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which of course, Elizabeth is one of the co-chairs. So you're seeing that linkages across so many stakeholders, which I think is perhaps, as we've heard already, one of the key innovations or improvements that we're seeing in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as compared to Aichi. At the same time, given the discussion of values that we've had already, I think, and looking at a lot of the media coverage of the convention, I think there still remains the need to overturn some unhelpful narratives. And the first is the neoliberal narrative. The idea of the instrumentalization of nature, ideas around offsetting, that we can somehow substitute the extinction of a particular species by doing something else elsewhere, that sort of idea that individuals alone should be the target of these issues, dealing with issues of consumption and production, the key drivers of biodiversity loss. At the same time, I think there's still the need to address the neo-colonial narrative you hear often in the press this idea about, oh, we need to protect wilderness areas somewhere far, far over there, rather than acknowledging, as the science and knowledge is so clear, that it's those areas that have been managed for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples and local communities. The biodiversity thrives in particular areas because it has been looked after, not otherwise. And yet you still see some of the narrative around, well, developing countries, they just want funding in order to do something. Yes, as a legitimate right for recognizing the role of the continued protection of particular lands. So hopefully what we will see in the next few days, because that's how urgent action is, but importantly in years, is a virtuous cycle of value change in feedback with legal change at multiple scales, involving a range of different actors. The synthesis of knowledge and science is clear. It remains possible to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. We need to act now and in ways radically different to the current unsustainable status quo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, for this very interesting, instructive, and illuminating perspective. And I can reassure you, the worry you expressed initially, you've certainly added to the conversation and to the consideration to your contribution, very much so. Thank you indeed. So now we'll have the first opportunity for our esteemed speakers to react to some of the questions that have been fielded so far. We have received more than 100 comments through the Q&A. Thankfully, thanks to the support by our dear Mr. Roberto Cole, as well as Mrs. Dantana Brashti, as well as the direct reactions from our speakers so far. Most of them have already been addressed. We have about 20 that are open, and I'll briefly run through them and then invite Elizabeth, our dear Executive Secretary, as well as Michelle, if they would like to react to some of them. So I can see that Peter Nyoka from Kenya is wondering about the support that Africa may have benefited from when it comes to climate change adaptation and mitigation when confronted to the levels of hunger and general poverty. We hear also from Santiago, who's asking, based from Venezuela, how he can join the process and project from that are currently ongoing from the perspective of the traditional knowledge that they have as a traditional local community in the Orinoco River. We also have Professor Marie-Claire Cordoni-Seger, who woke up quite early, based in Vancouver Island in Canada, and she's asking how to overcome legal barriers worldwide, such as paper parks, together through monitoring, for example. Elena Paul is wondering about the tension between the obligation of a corporation to return a profit and the serious negative impact it may have on biodiversity. How can you balance that in the context of the current model of economic growth and its coherence with the protection of biodiversity? We have Selwa Yaqoubi, who's asking how we can protect biodiversity in the face of intense urbanization, particularly in metropolitan cities. Murad Ahmim is asking about, at the national level, what can be the right attitude to adopt? Elements also of questions from Rabat, asking about the legal system, how it can make sure that laws are actually implemented and enforced. Murad is asking how we can foster cooperation with local experts to drive forward progress in the context of biodiversity. Aqil Al-Zubaydi is also asking about the importance of geodiversity on providing habitats and enriching biodiversity. A lot of invitations and expressions of interest in terms of contributing to this important agenda. A question as well about the One Health approach and how it connects to biodiversity conservation, the role of civil society and communities, how we can better envision it, the role that the World Commission on Environmental Law plays in terms of tracking opportunities for nature-based solutions of biodiversity when it comes to funding, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So at this stage, perhaps I'd like to revert back to the Executive Secretary, Michelle as well, Christina, of course, any of our opening speakers that maybe would like to briefly, and I would like to emphasize the word briefly, react to some of the questions that were raised. And I'm not saying briefly because I don't want to listen to you extensively, but because we are a bit behind schedule at this stage. Thank you very much. Perhaps, Elizabeth, would you like to come in first, perhaps?
Thank you very much. I was still going through the questions. I wish we were able to cluster them in some form. I've seen a number of questions related to how experts who may not be associated with the governments can get engaged, how the local communities also can be engaged. I might be the best, I may not be the best person to comment on what happens at national level, but theoretically, I can say and how we have supported a number of countries with regards to the development and review of their NBSAPs, for instance, that at national level is normally a consultative process. A number of consultation meetings, a number of seminars, workshops involving different actors at national levels are normally engaged in terms of discussions and seeing what finally find its way in the NBSAPs. What finally then gets adopted and whether all the views, comments incorporated, that is a different question. In terms of the local communities in particular, and I think the last speaker had mentioned that where the target now, where the framework is also calling on business, financial institutions, not only to report on the risks and impacts of the activities on biodiversity, but also to disclose those impacts. This means that for any activities taking place in the areas predominantly or occupied by indigenous peoples and local communities, then it means they are part of that. They need to be informed, they need to participate in the decision making, and it is the role of government through regulations and policies to ensure that this public participation and the local communities' participation is actually safeguarded and indeed takes place. So here I think the focus will be how that enforcement and implementation can be ensured at national level, that all different stakeholders are engaged on matters which they are interested, on matters which impact on them or impact on their resources or on the land or impacting biodiversity. And this is where I think law comes in, because the governments are there to put the laws and the policies in place, but also to ensure those laws, regulations, policies are effectively actually enforced on the ground. I know this is a major challenge in many countries, but it's also a challenge for us lawyers that we should not only ask to have the laws in place, but also go beyond having the laws on the paper to the actual enforcement. So by and large, that's what I can say.
Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. So Michelle, I can see there is one reaction regarding specifically sociological and cultural specificities that's addressed to you. I can see also some reactions as well linked to illicit financial flows, corruption, and connection to biodiversity, and how they were addressed or not addressed by the Global Biodiversity Framework and other relevant fora. Also emphasizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and what role you can play in achieving the GBF. My brother, David Munene, from the co-regional facilitator, Major Group of Stakeholders Africa, is asking about the specific action point for faith-based organizations to support action. Professor Marie-Claire Cornelius-Seger is reacting again, highlighting leadership from legal experts and asking how we can scale up cooperation, also in the context of the biodiversity law and governance day that took place during COP15 in Montreal. questions, again, about implementation, localizing education and raising awareness when it comes to biodiversity conservation, etc. Michelle, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I might respond to the comment by Murad by emphasizing or reiterating that point of the importance of cultural and social issues and specificities, and on the other hand, highlighting the challenge for biodiversity, which is such a place-based cultural issue, and the challenge of regulating that at the global level, but at the same time, building on Elizabeth's point about the role of law, I think there's also a huge role on expanding what we traditionally think of as law, the importance of embracing and recognizing indigenous laws that have developed as part of the land. For example, if you look both in Australia and in Indonesia, in indigenous laws around cultural burning, how the blanket bans on burning in 2 areas that are very fire prone, blanket bans on burning actually ignore the underlying social, cultural, and legal, not in the sense that we know it in terms of the state, but indigenous laws which actually have evolved with the land over thousands of years, and therefore the importance of bringing in a range of ways to look at law and not forgetting that underlying laws are issues of values, and the importance of elevating indigenous laws and governance systems that engage with a range of other value systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michelle. So I think, Sonia, you've been reacting directly through messages, much appreciated, efficient, and helpful to me as a moderator. Christina also has been very reactive and in that regard as well. So I think we're in a position to move straight to the next session, which is dedicated to youth leadership in biodiversity. It was highlighted by all of our speakers so far as an important component going forward of this biodiversity framework. In that regard, our first speaker in that session, and she belongs to a network that was already introduced by the Executive Secretary, and that is, of course, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Ms. Swetwa Stotra Bashaya is the Global South focal point of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. That network has more than 1 million members. It has 550 member organizations and 40 regional and national chapters, and it is the official youth constituency to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. She is a budding wildlife biologist from India. She holds a master's degree in wildlife biology and conservation. She has dedicated the past decade of her life to working with several grassroots and international organizations in helping to conserve biodiversity. As one of the most influential youth voices in the global biodiversity space, could you perhaps share with us your perspective of COP15, Sweta?
Eamon, it was really nice. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to be with so many people that we have seen at COP15. So lovely to see you, Elizabeth and Sonia here, and also Christina. It's great to be on this call with all of you, sharing our experiences and insights from COP15. I should definitely say the journey for COP15 started much before COP15 itself, and it was a journey that kept it was like something that was kept procrastinating itself, not by intention, but just by the way it happened. But it was something that took us almost 4 years, and definitely, as Elizabeth mentioned, it had its pros and cons. One of the biggest pros we had in this 4-year journey towards COP15 was that we were able to actually go and consult young people all over the world. We were able to have like national consultation workshops in over 100 countries, many of them even in person and many virtual, and we were able to consult youth on the ground, asking thousands of young people people what it really meant for them to live in harmony with nature and what they would like to see in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And that kind of was where our journey began, asking the youth of the world what is it that they wanted. And that helped us also come to a space of a common understanding of some of the key priorities that young people thought were really important to be reflected in the post-2020 and the global biodiversity framework at that time. Some of the key things that we had discussed and thought would be critical to have were definitely intergenerational equity, transformative education, and also a rights-based approach for nature and people. And given these priorities, we kind of went into the battleground in a way, and we used all weapons at hand. We created a massive campaign called Stop the Same, which really meant stopping business as usual and really ushering an era of diversity and transformation that we want as the future, and really pushing the world to start seeing that we are stuck in a vicious cycle of a toxic cycle and we need to get out of it. We also then went into lobbying our governments at the national level. We held intergenerational dialogues with them and talked to them about what are some of the national youth priorities that were identified by youth in their country, and then lobbied their governments at those, even at the national stages, to really understand where young people are coming from and what we want. So in that way, I think COP15 has been many firsts for us, and it's really been a beautiful journey in a way, and a space where young people were really able to come together. And it really was a space which was more than just a conference of parties for us, because it was for the first time that we were able to have the largest youth summit for youth with over 400 young people coming together just before COP. We had all key dignitaries. Elizabeth was there, the COP presidency was there. We had everybody come. Ministers had joined us. Antonio himself, himself was there with us for a dialogue. So it was a great space for young people to really interact, and their value was really felt. We also, for the first time, did a march. We had a march for human rights and biodiversity, which had over 3,500 people on the streets of cold Montreal. And that was also a first time for us, because we've never marched before for biodiversity, because we never needed to. But this time we really felt we had to march. And I felt like it did have a strong impact, especially in the community there. You could really feel like the local people in Quebec were able to fully engage as well with the COP, even in spite of not fully being at the COP itself. So it was an amazing space to see this celebration of diversity and culture through a march. So yeah, so we had a lot of amazing things that really happened. And as Elizabeth said, it really was a beautiful space. And yeah, given as the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, we were able to, for the first time, bring in artists and young journalists and activists and musicians. We even had a rapper who rapped us an anthem, and it was our world leaders' call to action, which Elizabeth danced with us for. So definitely another first for us. So it was beautiful. I really felt like COP15 was a space that really brought cultural policy change, but with infusing it with cultural change and really showing how culture is such an integral part of this transformation that we need. So yeah, these are some of my most beautiful memories, I should say, from COP15. Also, I should say, as a disclaimer, it also had a sad memory for me, because at the end of COP, just before I had to go and give my high-level segment speech, I got COVID and I could not give my speech. So yes, it had its highs and lows from my personal experience. But maybe now coming into telling you guys a little bit about what Gibbon felt were some of the wins we had from the COP. Definitely the recognition of environmental defenders and the access to justice are some of the key things that we were pushing for. The fact that intergenerational equity is so well recognized really makes us feel empowered in the process. And as Elizabeth clearly said, it does feel like you as a stakeholder, you as a right holder are well recognized, and you are being valued in this framework, which makes us more and more inclined towards ensuring that we implement it, because this really represents who we are and what we wanted. And some of the key things we really like about the post-2020 was the fact that it is has a very good link between the social inequalities and environmental damage. It also has a good recognition of Indigenous people's rights, as Sonia also mentioned. Even the human rights-based approach was very clearly mentioned, so that, which is great for us. And definitely one of the key priorities that we pushed for, and now I'm happy to hear there are other proponents that that are also supporting education and youth and biodiversity in the space with what the Executive Secretary, Ms. Ala Ooi, mentioned. I'm happy that she also, there is such a good priority on education as well, because one of the key things that young people all over the world were saying is if we really need to get this right, and if we really need to change things, we need to change value systems, and we need to change what we believe in and how we behave as a society and as a community. And that means we need education to change. And the current education system cannot get us there. And that's why education for young people was so important. And it's so good that it was recognized also at the COP and in the framework. So these are some of the great things. I should obviously also highlight some of the things that young people are concerned about with respect to the framework itself. And some of the things definitely are also echoed by others with like the finance gap. It's great to have such amazing framework where everybody feels represented, but then there is also money that is needed to get that done. So that's something that we would want to push for as youth and also as with other stakeholders to really increase that ambition there. We also are a bit concerned with some of the solutions like, biodiversity offsets and credits and nature-based solutions, which still don't have the clear safeguards. And that's something that we are concerned about and we want to ensure is in place so that these things are not used for, are not seen as false solutions and are not used as other options of greenwashing. So these are things that young people do want to keep an eye out on and keep like a vigilant side to them. We also are worried about like the fact that in the framework itself, it feels like it looks like it's an open door for unregulated private funding schemes that are really that might not follow the principles of the GBF itself. So here are some of our concerns, and definitely we feel like the ambition that was set for the businesses to regulate themselves and make them accountable as key drivers of biodiversity loss is something that needs to be taken up a notch. And maybe these are things that we should push for in the coming negotiations. But given those weaknesses that we see in the framework, we definitely think it's an amazing step forward, and it definitely has major wins. And given that, I think young people and youth as such are already ready for implementation. On the last day of COP itself, we had a Youth into Implementation conference. We have launched our new campaign, which is Youth into Action, and it's all about getting people in action. We have now actually 50 national chapters and regional chapters that are ready to implement things, and they've already created their action plans of how they're going to support the implementation of the post-2020. They've spoken to their governments, and they're ready to, unleash themselves in the framework. And that's, I think, a great step. And I hope that everybody sees this as a great opportunity where you can see young people working with other stakeholders and especially the governments and others to ensure that the post-2020, the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework gets implemented. But I would like to leave you all with the reminder that I know that the framework is great and it's a great first step, but we need to acknowledge that what we need and what IPBES has very clearly told us is we need transformative change. We need a whole of society system-wide approach, and we need a system change and a transformative change. And that means that we need to really up the fire. We need to up it much more if we need to get that whole of society transformation to happen. And we still cannot be in our biodiversity bubble. We really need to find ways of, scaling it up if we really want things to change. And that's something that we want to push for and continue to push for, is working towards the leverage points that have been identified by IPBES in their transformative change reports, and also ensure that we, through education, push for the change in values, which we think is very critical for us to lead to transformative change. So yeah, given that, I hope we take this forward and get into implementation.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you ended on a note of transformative change that is very well aligned with the overall umbrella theme of this webinar series organized by the Commission, which is, of course, the transformative power of law. So there's clear, very strong alignment. I can also promise you, although I love singing, I will spare you my singing because I'm absolutely dreadful singer, but I'd be very interested to see the video, if there is, of Elizabeth, I'm sure, lovely dancing, very much so, indeed. So we'll move now to our next speaker in this brilliant session, and that will be Ms. Julieta Sarno, who is an Argentinian environmental lawyer and currently a doctoral researcher in international environmental law at Leuphana University in Germany. her dissertation aims to identify the implication of fragmentation within the global biodiversity regime from a legal and institutional perspective. She's a member of the Early Career Specialist Group of the IUCN Work Commission on Environmental Law. So, Ms. Arnaud, my question to you would be, could you share with us your perspectives on synergies and cross-cooperation among the biodiversity conventions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question and for the kind invitation to the Early Career Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. And I would also like to say many thanks to the wonderful speakers today. The Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has elaborated on the role and potential that synergies could play within the biodiversity regime and in relation to other multilateral environmental agreements in two key sections, particularly as part of the purpose of the framework and as one of the considerations for its implementation. In this regard, the framework has highlighted the role that synergies between the CBD and its protocols, other biodiversity-related conventions, and other multilateral environmental agreements could play in fostering coherence, complementarity, and cooperation. In addition to other COP decisions have further elaborated on this, notably on procedural aspects such as reporting and more generally on cooperation, which are two of the key decisions of this package deal. Synergies are a key mechanism to enhance implementation not only for the CBD, but also for other biodiversity-related conventions. And given the role of the CBD within the biodiversity regime of the Framework Convention, the Cumming framework is in fact a new global biodiversity strategy. And as such, not only the CBD, but also other biodiversity agreements such as Ramsar or CITES contribute to the implementation of the framework. This strategy can be best achieved through mechanisms and tools that promote synergies at different levels. Synergies and cooperation among biodiversity-related conventions and even outside the biodiversity regime is not a new issue on the global agenda. On the contrary, UNEP, especially through the work of the World Conservation Monitoring Center, has in recent years produced numerous reports and options for enhancing these synergies, which have been complemented by the Bern processes, workshops, and other activities. Synergies are also a key component to enhance a fundamental obligation of the CBD, which is Article 26 of the Convention, that is to submit national reports for the implementation of the Convention, an obligation that is also included in other biodiversity-related conventions. In this line, the voluntary and recently operational data submission tool for MEAs, also known as DART, is a way to help parties to use synergies for national reporting to many conventions such as CITES, Ramsar, and the CBD. So what is new in the Cumming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework compared to the previous strategy and its Aichi targets? The new framework is clearer and more concrete about the role that synergies and cooperation across conventions and organizations can play in implementing the overall biodiversity strategy. In the previous framework, this aspect was simply included in the section on partnerships as one more way to achieve effective implementation of the framework. But since then, the numerous UNEP and WCMC reports, the Bern processes, and the work of the liaison group of biodiversity conventions have contributed to the potential for synergies within the biodiversity regime. So in this sense, this new strategy, which is complemented by key 6 decisions, provide an opportunity to further develop and enhance synergies with lessons learned through the work of the COPs, UNEP, and other processes, such as the Cluster of Chemicals and Waste Conventions, from which this regime could also learn. And by building on these governance processes and entering implementation mechanisms in legal tools, synergies can provide a powerful tool to enhance implementation with the Cumming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much again for your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution to this event. We'll now move to the last but certainly not least speaker of this particular segment, Ms. Aya Nshib, who is 15 years old. She's from Rabat in Morocco. She has been engaged through 3 academic seasons for the Young Reporters for the Environment program, which is organized by the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection and its partners in Morocco and internationally. Aya, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all the people who were talking, and their special info and special saying are much better than what I researched about COP15. So thank you so much. So hello everyone, my name is Aishab. I'm 15 years old and I'm a young reporter from Morocco. I have the full honor to be with you in this important international meeting that sheds light on the environment and sustainable development. My presence with you is thanks to the Mohammed VI Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, headed by Her Royal Highness Princess Al Hassan, through the international program Young Reporters for the Environment, which integrates education, awareness raising, and environment in order to achieve sustainability. And through my personal experience, I commend the great work of the foundation because it helped me to build my personality, as it gives me the power of persuasion, teamwork, competition, advocacy of environmental issues, and the exchange of its knowledge internationally. I also extend my thanks to the foundation of Hassan to International Center for Training and the Environment, headed by the director of the center, Ayman Sarqawi. And frankly, as an academic unit of the institution, we young reporters are highly framed in it, and we have the opportunity to participate, form our personalities, and frame them in the field of environmental education. And so thanks to the Mohammed VI Foundation for the protection of the environment, which I personally consider the golden key for my generation and for future generations. My involvement in biodiversity is due to the Mohammed VI Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, of course, through the international program Young Reporters for the Environment, which is organized every year on various environmental topics, including biodiversity. This program that links the curriculum and the 17 goals of sustainable development. And through my experience, I have benefited well from the courses that the foundation is carrying out at the Hassan II International Environmental Training Center, in partnership between the foundation and the Ministry of National Education and Primary Education and Sports. So we get to have the choice to participate according to the 3 categories: the photograph, the journalistic reportage, or the journalistic video, as well as international cooperation. Through this program, I gained ecological awareness about the importance of biodiversity and the need for preservation, especially since my country, Morocco, is rich in biodiversity according to the regions. Through my participations in Young Reporters for the Environment Protection, I participated in environment competition. I made a written article on environmental pollution, especially the plastic pollution, where I took pictures of places near my house and my neighborhood related to the chosen topic. And personally, when I looked to search those photos, I feel like that was my job. I feel like this is what I want to do. I feel the dangers that people were in, and I knew that I can stop this phenomenon from spreading more and more. So I decided to start sensibilizing people by publishing those photos and to let them know the danger that they were living in. And this made me gain more information and knowledge, and also meet a lot of people from Morocco and abroad, and made a lot of connections with people that made me gain a lot of information about COP15 and also climate change that I was present there. Yeah, and here I am with you here. So I listening to your advices and also your experts your expert saying. So thank you very much, and thank you again for this international cooperation.
Thank you, Aya, for your passion and leadership. Let me tell you that you're far ahead of where I was at your age in terms of your commitment for the protection of the environment. So thank you very much for that, much appreciated. We'll now move to the next segment of our webinar today, session 3, which is dedicated to what approach should universities take to ensure that species and ecosystem begin to recover. The Secretary General of the Foundation referred, for example, at the African level to the program that we have, the African Green Universities and Youth Education Network in partnership with UNEP, but we'll be listening at a broader perspective, more global, from Ms. Emily Stott, who works at the research coordinator in the Department of Biology, University of Oxford. She coordinates a global network of universities signing up to start a nature positive journey in collaboration with UNEP, Youth Education Team, and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. She has developed the Nature Positive Pledge and Student Ambassador Program, and she has studied in archaeology, anthropology at the University of Cambridge. She also has a master's in research and sustainable textiles at the University of Leeds. She has worked in sustainability for almost 10 years with environmental NGOs. Emily, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I'm from the Department of Biology, University of Oxford, part of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science, where the focus is on combining natural and social sciences to give new insights on issues that influence our relationship with nature. So I'm really excited to share our initiative, Nature Positive Universities, which has been going for about a year now. So I'm going to ask, how can universities help halt biodiversity loss and support transformative change that we need? So I'm going to describe a framework that universities can follow to lead by example in tackling biodiversity impacts through public commitments, targets, actions, and accountability. So I will focus on the role that universities can play for biodiversity, not in the traditional sense as centres of research in biology, environment, and policy, but focusing on some of the wider areas of influence relating to a university's operations and implementation. So how did this come about? University of Oxford rewrote their sustainability strategy in 2021 after wide consultation with a range of stakeholders, including management, academics, students, and operations staff. And we were fortunate to have some very vocal students and academics in biodiversity who were there saying, and biodiversity at every point. So carbon sort of takes the headline normally, and many universities now are setting targets for carbon, like the net zero carbon targets, but we have a twin targets of net zero carbon and biodiversity net gain by 2035. And this is reflecting the UK legislation that comes in later this year for biodiversity net gain for all new buildings. But when we say these words, biodiversity net gain, we're not just meaning sort of compliance legally with new buildings, we're looking at the university as a whole and all of its impacts, including the supply chains. So having set these sort of ambitious targets, we partnered with UNEP, Youth and Education Unit in Nairobi, to try to form a kind of race to zero type of movement, but for the higher education's biodiversity impact, supported by the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We now have a network of people from over 500 institutions joined together to collaborate in this initiative. So higher education in its operations has a massive biodiversity impact, from the food eaten on campuses to the land and buildings we occupy, to the paper, lab equipment, IT equipment that we use. This all adds up and needs addressing. Looking at Oxford's biodiversity footprint, we started by carrying out a detailed study looking at all of the purchasing data for the university, converting it into life cycle impacts, and then into a sort of proxy biodiversity measure. And we found that, like for carbon, the majority of our impacts were actually indirect and hidden in our supply chains. For example, at Oxford, our laboratories have a huge impact on nature. But of course, universities do a lot of good. Our research and education projects worldwide have saved and restored a lot of biodiversity. And we, as universities, have the opportunity to inspire generations of students and influence our cities and communities. So what do we mean by nature positive? Obviously, the definition can be contentious and it's not widely agreed. There's also a lot of opportunity for greenwashing. but we've focused on restoring the species and ecosystems that have been harmed by the impacts of a university and its activities, and enhancing the university's positive impacts on nature. And this aligns with the global goal for bending the curve on biodiversity loss by 2030 to give ecosystems a chance to recover by 2050. So how we do this, we are using a framework called the conservation hierarchy, which is about prioritizing a hierarchy of actions to tackle biodiversity footprint. And these are refrain, reduce, restore, and renew. So importantly, starting with avoiding the most harmful actions first, and then reducing what it's possible to reduce before finally to try to get to nature positive by restoring the residual impacts that you can't reduce unless you sort of shut down all of your operations or laboratories. So the founding universities in our alliance have all committed to undertaking their own nature positive journey by making a concrete pledge, which includes a baseline, targets, and actions as guided by these 4 steps until they can account for and mitigate their impacts at some point in the future. And we think by doing this transparently, universities can help guide their wider communities and partners on a similar journey, inspire their students of all disciplines to be proud of their universities in taking these steps. When increasingly businesses will be forced to disclose their impacts on nature, and we think universities can lead the way as pioneers who are choosing to do this transparently. So we launched these pledges at CBD COP15 in Montreal, with universities from almost 50 countries joining to make pledges. And we sensed a real momentum with the Nature Positive Pavilion and this sort of movement behind the importance of setting targets for 2030. And so we now have a community of over 100 institutions ready to get to work, including 20 African institutions. And we'd love to invite some Moroccan institutions to join us. It's not too late. So one of the next steps for us will be sharing guidance and case studies from this network with examples of the baseline studies undertaken at universities all around the world and examples of best practice from our global network. And I wish I could show you some photos now. I had a great presentation, but you'll have to check our website. It's really lovely just to see what's going on all around the world. So to complement this, those pledges are sort of high-level pledges set by vice chancellors and management of universities. To complement this, we've established a student ambassadors program, which currently comprises around 200 students on campuses around the world to get involved with nature restoration and support their universities to start these journeys. And students can really help seize the urgency and sort of push their institutions to be more ambitious. And that's what we found at University of Oxford with our consultation. It was really students that pushed us much further than we would have gone in setting these targets. And increasingly, students are demanding green jobs and skills, and that they need their university experience to equip them for the climate and ecological challenges ahead. So students in this program can get involved practically with campus wildlife surveys and citizen science, taking action to clean up degraded areas and tackle plastics, and share their experiences with a global network of students on campuses around the world. We're soon launching a student toolkit, and we have monthly meetings on different topics, and we particularly welcome students from Morocco and beyond to join us. So to sum up, we want our campuses to be shining examples of urban green spaces and green infrastructure, and kind of renewed spaces for nature and people thriving together. This network is also meant to be a collaboration between universities from different parts of the world so that we can create new research partnerships that protect and restore biodiversity where it's most vulnerable. And we would especially like equitable partnerships between universities with a large biodiversity footprint, taking responsibility for that, and those on the front lines feeling the effects of climate change and nature degradation, who have local knowledge to inform the best restoration efforts. And we hope to develop some part of the funding gap and sort of bridging those partnerships between global North and global South universities, or universities with the big impacts and universities really feeling those impacts. We would love to establish some mechanisms for funding there. We're also establishing regional hubs so that neighbouring universities can support each other in these efforts. So we're really excited by the possibilities of universities as beacons for action on nature, and really involving every part of a university ecosystem, from the management to administration, researchers and students, down to the gardeners and the chefs. We welcome you all to join us, and a growing community of institutions leading others on a global nature positive journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily, for your contribution and this call for partnership and inclusion. Much appreciated. And I think, as I was saying, one of the comments in the Q&A, I'm certain that you will find echoes among the participants in today's event in terms of more stakeholders to join and existing stakeholders that are your partners to deepen their engagement. Thank you very much, Emily, for your contribution. We have reached the time for our second and last Q&A. So I'd like to invite, in particular, Sweta, Giulietta, Aya, and Emily to react to any of the contributions, the written comments or questions that they can see in the chat, the Q&A, more precisely function from Zoom, or also if perhaps they would like to react to one another's contributions if they see that there's no particular question they wanted to react to in the chat. So I'll follow the same order as the speakers list in terms of asking for reactions for these latest two sessions. And I'll start therefore with Sweta. Sweta, is there anything you would like to react to at this stage? Thank you.
I do not see too many questions for us, so I would just say I loved what my fellow speakers mentioned. I definitely agree with Giulietta about synergies. That is going to be a critical thing for us to take forward. We need to start working with different youth groups and communities, but also pushing for synergies between all stakeholders. If you need a whole of society thing, that was kind of what I was saying in the end, but I completely see Giulietta's point on ensuring that happens and how we could do it. And just wanted to say, totally inspired by Aya and how she's doing so much at 15. And yeah, it's so awesome to learn from her. And I hope that we are able to collaborate as well in the future and see how we can do things as well. So yeah, great.
Thank you very much. Giulietta, I was seeing you nodding quite a bit as Sweta was speaking. Is there anything you would like to say?
Thank you so much, Ayman, and thank you, Sweta, as well for your contribution. I mean, after hearing Aya and Sweta in my panel on youth, I feel very much inspired by their work. You're doing it. I'm also part of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, although I'm not very active, but after hearing your presentation today, I think it was a great push for me to be also much engaged in that network as well. And yeah, I wanted also to encourage you to continue that work. Don't get discouraged on the work of youth and the role of youth, particularly for biodiversity processes, will continue to increase and will move much forward. So your work is very inspiring, and I hope you can continue to inspire so many others.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at Aya next, and a bit of a spoiler alert, but there's this Global Youth Biodiversity Network that sounds very exciting. How do you feel about that, Aya?
I actually did not hear the question very well. Can you repeat it, please?
Okay, I'll repeat it a bit more slowly. I was saying that there is this Global Youth Biodiversity Network very aptly represented here. Were you inspired by what you heard from Sweta or any of the other contributions in particular? Thank you.
Of course, I was inspired. All their contributing were interesting, and I gained a lot of information this day, and I'm so glad I'm here hearing their information. That of course I will follow them, and I will search more about COP15 for biodiversity to know more about it, and thank them so much for their work and everything that they give.
Thank you very much, Aya. Emily, would you like to come in at this point?
Sure, yeah, there was one question by Helena Paul, which was asking the primary obligation of a corporation is to return a profit, and in view of the negative impact, can the current model ever be coherent with protecting biodiversity? I think this is a good question to answer in light of a university, because in many ways, a university, especially a large one like Oxford, is like a corporation in many ways. I mean, it has a huge impact. And so the challenge of if we're committing to nature positive, what does that really mean? And can we ever get there? And I can't really answer that. The question is, we surely need system change to get there. I mean, we looked at some really ambitious scenarios for what Oxford could do avoiding everything that could be possible. For example, no more paper use, no more meat served in canteens, no more flights, really sort of severe scenarios. We looked at several models. And even if you did that, and then reduced further everything that we could, sort of cutting down the transport, cutting down any overseas travel, we still found that it only reduced something like 1/3 of our biodiversity impact. So it leaves this huge amount of residual impact if we still want to function as a university with our research. And so how do you get to nature positive? How do you get to a kind of net overall positive impact, which is just a huge question. So obviously there's very contentious, the idea of offsetting or mitigating in terms of having land that somehow balances out that impact. There's many problems with it. But what is there? What options are there to get from that impact that is there to a positive one? And I think at the moment, I just have to say we need massive system change. We need to be looking at plant-based diets. We need to be questioning all of the things that we're buying and purchasing and consuming. Like, it has to change at a systematic level to achieve that. And there's just not enough land. Even if there were no problems with offsetting, there's just not enough land to go round. There's not enough land that all of those companies can offset their way out of it, because it just doesn't match up with the demand for food and food security and all of the things we need land for. So I think it just emphasizes again that we just have to sort of somehow get this urgency of systematic change for the way we address things. And yeah, there's just no answer to carry on with business as usual, as I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily. So at this stage, as we're inching towards the closing of today's webinar, I'd like to roll back time in a sense and look towards the speakers that are still with us, that have their cameras on, and ask them in a bit of a reverse order if there's anything they wanted to react to or share with us as we are closing this webinar that I personally found very, very inspiring, but maybe a bit biased. So Michelle first, please, go ahead.
I think just to support a lot of what's been said around this need for systems change. Yes, the GBF has achieved far more than I expected. Into the second week, it was all brackets, and then suddenly there is something that's much further along than any initial draft. So that is absolutely to be commended, and also the role of non-state actors in bringing about that change. But at the same time, as has been reiterated, the stakes are so high, the status quo can no longer stand, and yet there are powerful interests that seek to maintain that. So chipping away is important, but importantly thinking about where the levers are, how transformative change can be brought about to maintain the diversity of life on Earth.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, for this reaction. Sonia, you're up next.
Thank you. So I was going to just comment on there was one question, and I already tried to answer it in writing, but there was the question was about paper parks and how to avoid, or how do we avoid, the situation whereby the application of the targets and we move forward, we still have like this situation where it's in paper, but it is not, fully implemented or actionable or actually practically made. So I think that here we have to, and this applies for all the targets, not only target 3 in this case, the 30 by 30, which has, created a lot of buzz around what does it mean. But for all the targets, I think that we have to start that process of unpacking the elements of each one of those 23 targets, and see how at the national level we are able to translate those elements into concrete actions and drive that process of implementation or understanding, translating, etc., of those global targets to the national level in much more, practical ways. Because if we leave it at the level of global targets without the connection to those actions that are needed at the national level to make them implementable, then we're gonna miss the boat or the train. And actually, we have only 7 years to go. So if we don't speed up that process of translation, understanding, unpacking at the national level, we're not going to make it. So the other part of the story is make use of what is already available. And I alluded also to the existing data, the tools, the mechanisms, capacity initiatives, etc. So let's make use of what we have, but let's speed up with that, move into implementation.
Thank you, Sonia. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayman, and thanks to everyone. It's been a fantastic journey listening to all of you, and journey in a way because we covered all levels from the multilateral international level all the way down to national, regional, national, subnational, and university scopes as addressed by Emily. And I found this extremely fascinating, but it also highlights the complexity of what we're facing and the need for these transformative changes, without which we will never be able to achieve the goals, whether it's in the global biodiversity framework or on climate change or on global pollution. Being able to see these challenges in an integrated manner and to address them in an integrated manner, I think is probably one of the biggest questions of our time in general, when it comes to policies, when it comes to finance, but also when it comes to law. I think we will need new types of regulations, new laws, new approaches of interventions that we perhaps haven't seen yet and haven't contemplated and considered yet. Of course, there's a lot of revisions of existing laws that will be needed, but maybe there are also new legal instruments that need to be explored. And it's an invitation to everyone joining us today to apply a constructive legal, creative legal mind, understanding the challenges, understanding the guidance that we have in that package framework from Montreal, and thinking about what kind of legal responses are needed, because we can't expect anyone to change just by accident. There are changes underway, but in many cases it is legal interventions that are needed in terms, for example, when it comes to spatial planning or regulating supply chains or regulating investment frameworks that needs to integrate these new targets, and not just as an exception clause or something, but as the main purpose in regulations. I think I'll leave it at that, but with a big thank you to everyone, and of course to you as well, Ayman, for your wonderful moderation. And back to you, Ayman.
Thank you very much, Christina. I can but echo our thanks, and your thanks as more collective thanks, of course, and thanks to you, Christina, for your leadership of the Commission and the partnership between the IUCN World Commission Environmental Law and the Hassan II International Environmental Training Center in the context of this webinar. I would like also, of course, to thank all the speakers, all the participants, also, of course, my colleagues at the Commission, Mr. Roberto Cole, who has been instrumental in supporting the organization of this webinar, as well as my colleagues here at the center, Mrs. Lubna Shauni and Ms. Zainab Rashdi, thanking the translators as well that have been very reliable in their translation, and apologizing because I'm aware that I tend to speak fast, which translators tend to absolutely hate, and I really appreciate their understanding of that. Please stay tuned for next steps regarding today's webinar. It has been recorded. It will be posted online on the website of the partners of this particular event. We are organizing other activities, other webinars during the year as part of the series, as part of the different activities in terms of capacity building, in terms of awareness raising across environmental issues. So please stay tuned following us on social media, keeping an eye on the website, of course, of the Commission of the IUCN and of the Center. We are just starting the year. We have a lot of exciting activities to look towards to. And thanking you again, all of you, for your contributions and engagement. All the many questions we have fielded, I think they were more than 170 that were tackled in one way or another. Strong participation as well. At some point I saw there were more than 400 participants that were connected at the same time. I think this is quite a strong signal of the level of interest that this topic creates. Thank you. Have a good evening, have a good morning for some of you perhaps who are just waking up, have joined us very late. Have a good night for those that have joined us very, very late. See you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.